Hi, welcome to Plato's Cave, your speakeasy for ideas, where Tom and Dave show us how to think like the American founders. Grab a drink if you'd like. The conversation about saving our republic is about to begin.
Tom, you look a little run down. Are you still hungover from the Super Bowl? It's been a few days.
A little peaked, huh?
Yeah.
No, I actually didn't get to do much celebrate. I am 52 years old, Dave, and I have discovered that people develop allergies as they get older, and I've developed allergies. We know that it's allergies. I don't know what's causing it. I've been missing a lot of sleep and stuff. It's one of the reasons we got to build this business up so we can hire a big staff so I can go home and get some sleep once in a while.
Get some more sleep every once in a while. These 18-hour, 20-hour days are brutal. There was a joke going around during the Super Bowl. This was all over Twitter right after the halftime show. And I know there was some controversy during the halftime show. And I quite frankly, I'm over it. Like, I don't care. I didn't catch it. Somebody kneeled and I didn't see it and I didn't notice.
For the record, the halftime show was neither the best ever nor the worst ever.
So
it was somewhere in between.
A lot of people are calling it the best ever.
Yeah.
The other joke, though, that I loved going around Twitter, and it did kind of hit me. They said at the end of halftime, if you knew every word to every halftime song, it's time to go to bed. So, and I realized that was my high school and college. Like, that was all my high school and college, and it made me feel a little bit old. But speaking of high school and college, it wasn't intentional, but this kind of played out perfectly.
Good transition there.
Speaking of high school and college, we learned this week that there are now 12 states that are actively creating bills to create or recreate the curriculum for students that's really coming out of the pandemic. And what we're hearing a lot of coming out of the pandemic and everything that's happened and all the remote learning is you had a lot of parents who started looking over their children's shoulder, watching what their children were learning, watching how their children were learning, watching what the teachers were actually teaching, and realizing, this is not going to work for me. We can't continue this. We saw a huge push during the 2020 campaigns. And especially even the 2021 campaigns, Glenn Youngkin, for example, in Virginia, of people starting to say education is the number one issue. And it likely will be. There's three real issues that are going to affect campaigns in 2022 and likely 2024. It's crime, it's economy, inflation, that kind of stuff, and it's education. So we're seeing this huge push into education.
Well, and it's sort of a perfect storm because you had the pandemic and all these closures and lockdowns and millions of students learning from home. And so the parents could see and hear what was going on. So that kind of sparks an interest. At the same time, this all follows this wave of Black Lives Matter movement and the launching of the 1619 Project, all of which was sort of separate from the pandemic, but it brought to into focus of public conversation, critical race theory, and these types of subjects being injected into the curriculum of various schools. And so you have a lot of people, a lot of parents, not quite sure how to think about all this or what to think about all this, but they're concerned. They're worried about what is it that's actually being taught in their kids' schools.
I've also wondered what age these parents were focused on. I mean, you would assume it's the younger kids, right? It's their parents who are at home with them. It's one thing for a high school student to be at home. Parent doesn't need to be home with their high school kid, watching what their high school kid is learning. In fact, I don't think many were. It's the younger kids where you can't leave your kid at home alone. So you got to be home with your younger child. A lot of homes don't allow kids to have computers in their own room or computers in a private place because of all of the horrible things that I don't want to say horrible, but there's a lot of really bad things that kids can get into on the internet. And I'm not one for controlling the internet and banning the internet and anything else, but it's a lot of the younger kids where parents are starting to see this. I really wonder if parents saw what their kids are learning in high school, because I suspect that it's a whole lot worse than we even know in high school than it is at some of the younger ages. At some of the younger ages, you get the occasional teacher who says, 2 + 2 = 4 is racist and we can't have that.
Right.
It's in high school where they start teaching really getting into white privilege and some of these things that.
Well, I do know. I mean, I think there's an effort to reach younger audiences. I just saw the 1619 Project has announced they're releasing their first series of children's books. They took that material from the 1619 Project and turned it into illustrated books and various sorts of formats for young kids. So they want to reach younger kids if at all possible.
They do, and I think that was always the intention. You start them young, and you start teaching them the foundations at that young age, so that you can more easily get through to them when they get to high school.
Right.
And then you have just the whole problem of quality of teaching, and I think that's something we can get into in general.
It's an important subject, right? Because what this points to, this concern that we see of education, and I agree with you, by the way, I think this is going to be a main topic in coming election cycles. And it raises the question, first of all, the sort of the foundational question is, what is education? What should education actually be? And this is one of the themes that we encourage at the Vino and Veritas Societies. We talk about going back and looking at original source material, and in some cases, really old original source material, including books and arguments and ideas that are thousands of years old, going back to the ancient Greek thinkers, because there's a certain freshness there, right? Whereas like modern education bureaucrats today assume that they know exactly what education is or should be, those classical thinkers were raising this question for the first time. What is education? What does it mean to educate? What does it mean to learn? Mm-hmm. What kinds of things should people be learning? It also raises questions about what can actually be done in terms of legislation, in terms of either prohibiting certain ideas or certain texts, certain kinds of literature, if you prohibit certain things, or you command that certain things be included. Very closely connected, what can actually be accomplished with standards, educational standards. I was out in California when I was in graduate school, and I was working at the Claremont Institute, a think tank out in California. There was this is hard to believe, it's California after all, but there was this brief moment, I think it was 2 years, in the mid-90s, 1990s, when Republicans actually controlled the state legislature, and there was a fairly conservative Republican, Pete Wilson, who was governor at that time. And those California Republicans were really interested in education, and they decided to revise the state standards. And they got a hold of us at the Claremont Institute and said, "Well, you guys are experts on the founding. Will you help us?" Yeah. So we did. We worked with them. And I participated. I haven't gone back and looked in years. I don't know how many of these standards still exist or not. But there were some things on the surface certainly looked pretty good. The standard said if you're going to graduate from a high school, public high school in California, students should know the basics of the Declaration of Independence, the Constitution. We even got some of the numbers of the Federalist Papers injected in there, and George Washington's first inaugural address. Literature that many Americans would say, yeah, those are good foundational things. Students should certainly be familiar with those things. And then after that work was done, I was part of a team to go observe how those standards were implemented in schools. And I will never forget going to I think it was La Puente High School. And it was the kind of high school, it was a tough high school. There was fences and razor wire all around. There was a police officer, not a security guard, a police officer on the school grounds who had to unlock things and let me in, escort me in.
Seems like a good learning environment.
And I walked in and sat in. It was a senior government class. And the teacher walked in and she said, "Okay, students, the new state standards say we have to talk about the Declaration of Independence. So open your text to such and such page. We are going to spend the next hour discussing what those racist, sexist, homophobes had to say in 1776.
Well, and they were clearly sexist because it's the natural rights of men, right? I mean,
right.
Forget that they meant human beings. It's the natural rights of men. So
all men are created equal, right?
All men are created equal. Go ahead.
Well, the point is, from her perspective, right, she was compelled by the state education standards. They say you shall, as a teacher, you shall teach the Declaration of Independence. And so from her point of view, standing at the front of the room, denouncing Jefferson and the other founders as racists and sexist and homophobes, that was her way of teaching, talking about the Declaration of Independence. And for me, it was a tremendous learning moment because I instantly recognized you cannot capture good education, real education, even in standards. Standards can be twisted and distorted in both ways. You can set up standards with good materials, good books, and they can be twisted and turned for a bad purpose. Mm-hmm. And the opposite. You can start with really bad books and you can have a very good outcome. Yeah. Just like that teacher was teaching a terrible lesson about the Declaration of Independence, I've been teaching the lessons of liberty from using things like the writings of Karl Marx and other postmodern theorists. You can extract from those things the ideas of liberty. And what all this reminds me of, there was a beautiful conversation between James Madison and Thomas Jefferson. Those two, of course, were close friends throughout their adult lives and collaborators, and they corresponded voluminously over decades. And they worked together in founding the University of Virginia. Right. They were both very involved in that effort. Jefferson thought it was one of his greatest achievements, was creating the University of Virginia. And they were talking about the curriculum for the government and politics department. They were really interested in that because they knew that that's where future statesmen and judges, politicians, lawmakers are going to be educated. So they wanted to get that right. And Jefferson sent a curriculum to Madison for him to look over. And he included the Declaration of Independence as the foundational basis of the American Union, the Constitution, the Federalist Papers. Madison wrote back, congratulated Jefferson, said that this is a really good list. He had a few documents he wanted to add. He wanted Washington's farewell address to be included. And then Madison made a very astute comment that is directly applicable to all these efforts, all these concerns we see about curricula today. Madison said, while it's good to have good texts and good books, in the end, the most important thing is to have, and I'm going to quote him, able and orthodox professors. Right. Professors who understand the principles of liberty and care about them and cherish them and want to communicate and really inspire their students with that. That matters, and having those able and orthodox professors or teachers is more important than the curriculum that is set up. And I think that's something that gets lost in some of these education discussions today. A lot of people think, well, if we just adopt certain standards or pass certain legislation banning certain ideas or themes or books, then everything's going to be okay.
Well, we've talked in the past about how many of the progressives used the arguments contained within the Federalist Papers, particularly the paper on the Bill of Rights. Yeah. What is it, 84?
Yeah, 84, yeah.
84. They used it as a guide. I mean, Madison and Hamilton literally sat there and said, we should not have a Bill of Rights because this could happen and this could happen and this could happen and this could happen. And you had guys like Dewey sit back and say, they're right. Let's do what they just said could happen. And they did it.
To that point, by the way, I mean, in a way, that has just run amok. Madison and Hamilton warned in the Federalist, they said, don't adopt a Bill of Rights because what will happen? As soon as you start to list rights, the political class will come along and say, sure, you have those rights, and we're going to define what they mean. Yeah. We're going to define what free speech means and what the right to bear arms mean, right? And when they define them, they control the limits of our liberty. And so you see that today, right? If you ask Nancy Pelosi, Nancy, do you believe in the right to bear arms? I guarantee she would say, of course. That is an important constitutional right, and we lawmakers should decide what kind of guns are included in the right to bear arms and what aren't.
What kind of guns are included, who should be able to have them, who should be permitted to have them, how much they should pay us for the right to have that permit. Yeah. And oh, by the way, our police that defend us personally and our personal bodyguards and our personal security, they should have whatever they need. Right. So they use that. And I would probably venture, and we have no way of ever proving this, but the same way that they looked at Federalist 84, Dewey likely looked back at those conversations between Madison and Jefferson and saw things like, we should have orthodox and able professors. And he said, we should, but they should not be orthodox to the Declaration and the Constitution. Right. They should be orthodox to the government. Their orthodoxy should be to progressivism.
Right.
And it's amazing how the progressives, the early progressives in particular, were such good students of the founding.
Yeah.
As a way of knowing their enemy.
It's a great point. I mean, you mentioned John Dewey, who really is the father of modern educational theory in the United States. To his credit or blame, depending on how you see this thing, he certainly is largely responsible for the design of modern teacher colleges. The idea where someone's going to go through college and you're not going to learn a discipline. You're not going to learn math or chemistry or English or history. You're going to learn how to be a teacher.
Right.
And you're going to graduate with a degree in education, and you're going to be a licensed certified teacher. And that whole model was to produce able and orthodox progressive teachers.
Right.
It didn't really matter if those teachers could teach math or history or any other subject. What mattered was that they were orthodox in their devotion to progressivism, and they would transmit that kind of faith in progressive government to their students.
Well, and I have a story that just confirms all of this. And I might have told this before on a podcast. I've told this before to at least some of our members, I think to you as well.
You're now officially getting old. This is one of the first signs of getting old, is when you start to forget how many times you've told a story before.
This story is so good, I can never tell it enough.
Okay.
And you know what? We're 90. This is our 90th podcast.
Yeah.
So I can't remember what we've talked about in 89 previous podcasts. That's 89 hours plus of content.
Yeah.
There's more than I'm going to be able to remember. But I want to contrast it before I even get into the story. We have talked numerous times about a friend of ours, former Congressman Bob Schaefer.
Yeah.
And today, Congressman Schaefer is the principal of Liberty Commons High School in Fort Collins, Colorado.
No, it's Liberty Commons School.
Oh, school.
It's K through 12.
Is it K through 12
there's actually
now? Okay.
2 schools. Liberty Commons School includes the elementary school and then the high school.
And then the high school.
Yep,
So
K through 12.
So at the high school, though, and I wanted to focus on the high school in particular.
Yeah.
Consistently for the last 4 years, that school has performed on a national level at the highest levels on SAT scores and ACT scores.
That's right.
In fact, I think at least one of the last 4, if not more than once, they have actually had the highest average in the nation.
Right.
So his school is producing some of the best thinking, knowledgeable, and educated students in the country.
Right.
And one of the things he has done is he said, you don't need a master's degree in education to work here.
In fact, let me make this point for those not familiar with Bob's school. It's a charter school, and a charter school, many people don't fully understand this. A charter school is a public school.
Right.
And that means there are tax dollars that come from the state based on the number of students. And a charter school can do many things. It can adopt the kind of curriculum and teach the way they want to teach and hire, which is the point you're going to make. One of the things they cannot do is they can't, unlike a private school, they can't choose who their students are going to be. They open their doors to anybody in the area, residents who want to send their kids there. And in a case like Liberty Common, if there are more kids than they have seats, then they do a kind of lottery. They put the names in a dish and pull them out, and whoever gets picked are the ones that get in. It's not like a private school where they say only people who can, afford $20,000 tuition a year gets to come here. It's open to everybody, and still they're outperforming all the other schools, including all the other private schools.
Right. So he has not said you have to have a master's degree in education to teach here. He's focusing on 2 things. He's looking for teachers who can be subject matter experts, who are orthodox and able, as Madison put it.
Yep.
And he's looking for teachers who understand that you have to be able to teach students how to think.
Yes.
And before I get into my other story, I've often said that was probably the most pivotal moment of my high school career was doing speech and debate, where we had to learn how to think. I had to argue things that I didn't understand or I didn't necessarily agree with. And truthfully, in high school, I didn't know what I believed in strongly enough, because I was forced into these situations where we'd have 3 or 4 or 5 debates in a day. And in one debate, I'm arguing that liberty is the most important principle in the history of the world.
Right.
And 5 hours later, I'm arguing that utilitarianism and the greatest good for the greatest many is the most important, and mob rule is important, and true democracy. And I had to make both of those cases equally well to be successful in what I was doing.
Which means you had to come to understand them.
Right.
You had to understand those ideas and those arguments. And then, the truth is, and then you were in a better position to decide which ones you agreed with and which ones you didn't, because you understood them.
Right. And so when I'd get to college, I start hearing my professors, I was a political science at CU Boulder. We all know what that department is like. And I start hearing professors saying, well, utilitarianism and democracy is really a good thing, and here's why. And I'm sitting there saying, you don't even understand it.
Right.
You don't know what you're talking about.
Right.
And so that's how I was able to do it. And I think Bob has done a really good job of that at even a younger age than I was, of teaching these students and getting these able and orthodox teachers in who can help their students.
Part of the lingo in the world of education is there are sort of 2 models of how to look at teachers. The old-fashioned traditional model is that the teacher is the sage on the stage, the wise person, learned person imparting knowledge to students. The more postmodern, progressive Dewey model is the guide on the side. So you're either the sage on the stage or the guide. The guide on the side is sitting off to the side saying, tell me how you feel, Dave. How do you feel about this math problem in front of you? And that's the guide on the side, encouraging students to express themselves. Whereas the sage on the stage model is the view that, no, the teacher actually knows some things that the students don't, and the teacher needs to explain it so that the students can learn. And Bob is very clear, as he has been building his school and developing his faculty, he wants sages on the stage. He's very clear about that. He'll even ask people in interviews, how do you see yourself as a teacher? Are you the sage on the stage, or are you the guide on the side?
Interesting. So this brings me to my story, where it is far from the sage on the stage. I knew this girl, this was probably 8 years ago, and we were out to dinner up in Boulder, and she had just finished her master's degree in education. And we had been having some conversations, and somehow a friend of mine had come up in conversation. His father was the valedictorian of his class, I want to say 1941, at Harvard.
Okay. And
Joe and Bobby Kennedy were in the audience. Bobby was about the same age. Joe was basically the businessman, leading the unions and everything else, or controlling unions and all of that kind of stuff at the time. And somehow this friend came up in the conversation. He was a friend of mine in college. And I said, yeah, his dad was valedictorian, and Joe and Bobby were in the crowd, and Joe approached him afterward and said, hey, I was really impressed with your valedictorian speech. I'd like you to come work for me. And he goes and he works for Joe Kennedy, and he becomes best friends with Bobby to the point that he was actually in the kitchen when Bobby got shot. And it was his best friend.
Yeah.
And Joe introduced him to his wife. So this guy, the father, was came from nothing, worked his way up, academic scholarship to Harvard in the late 30s.
Right.
The wife, her family came over on the Mayflower, owned huge portions of New York City, and now they're some of the largest philanthropic donors in the country, in different segments that they care about.
Yeah.
I don't even know what brought up the conversation at the time, but we start having this conversation. This girl had just finished her master's degree in education. She is a high school history teacher in Jefferson County, Colorado. And I'm thinking, okay, I'm telling her about this, and she's got to obviously be interested in history if she's a history teacher. And she stops me and she says, were Joe and Bobby related to JFK? She's not orthodox and able. She's not the sage on the stage. She's not somebody. She did not know who Joe and Bobby Kennedy were.
Yeah.
And is trying to teach high school kids history.
Yeah.
If she doesn't know Joe and Bobby Kennedy, she was a leftist. She was a progressive. She obviously knew who JFK was. She liked JFK. She thought JFK was a great president.
Right.
Think she knew who Socrates was? You think she knew who Aristotle was? Right. She might have heard of them. The best reference for her was probably Bill and Ted's Excellent Adventure. I mean, it was just astounding to me. And I sat there looking at her like, how are you teaching history to high school kids?
Well, here's another. I don't want to get too far in these weeds, but I'll put this out here. This is fairly common in the realm of public education. The way you get promoted and the whole pay scale has very little, if any, to do with actual performance.
Right.
There are, again, to use the lingo in education circles, there are lanes and steps, and it's basically a grid. And the lanes are how many years you've been teaching. That's partly how your pay is based. How many years. And then the steps are the degrees you get.
Yep.
And sort of, there's continuing education, credential, and all this. So when it comes to your pay, you say, I've been teaching X number of years and I have this degree, and they can point right to the spot on the chart and say, here is what you are going to get paid. And, one of the things that this leads to in traditional public schools is a phenomenon that's actually it's well chronicled, well documented and studied. Teacher burnout after 3 to 4 years. What very often happens is you get a new teacher, right, fresh out of college, and they're all inspired, right, and full of energy and enthusiasm. I love teaching and I love kids, and so they throw themselves into their job. They're staying there till 5, 6, 7 o'clock in the evening, making their classroom look nice and preparing great lesson plans, right, and doing all this work. And then 2 or 3 years into it, they start to notice the teacher down the hall is out of there at 3 o'clock. The minute the bell dings, that teacher's gone, doesn't do anything extra, and they're getting paid the same.
Yep.
And very quickly, right, that teacher who's all full of enthusiasm thinks, why am I putting in all this extra effort? I could be at home with my own kids, or seeing my spouse, or doing things I want to do, and they start to lose interest. One of the things that happens in the realm of charter schools and the more choice that you have is it allows some schools to start to reward excellence in teaching. I have no problem, putting in lots of plugs for Bob Schaefer's school, because he's doing it right. Mm-hmm. This is what they do. He has a kind of grid, but it has nothing to do if the number of years you teach is no guarantee of anything. It's not even a guarantee that you'll have a job. You have to perform, and they have various metrics of performing based on how students do, based on teachers helping fellow teachers become better, helping the school be better, helping the community at large be better. If you can demonstrate that you do these things, you get paid more money. If you don't do those things, you're not going to get raises. You might not even keep your job. And so it's really modeling that institution as a kind of business, like a business would reward, right? Yeah. The most productive, the employees who produce the most value, those are the employees that you pay the most.
Well, and what you're talking about is something I grew up with, very close to me in my childhood. I grew up with a mother and a stepfather. I know I've talked about this in the podcast. I can remember that much. My mother and my stepfather were both teachers in Denver public schools. And my mom was rewarded on a regular basis as one of the top teachers in the district, in the state. I vividly remember this. We would get phone calls from parents. They would track down our home phone number. And in the summer months leading up to the year, we would get calls from parents saying, my son or daughter will be in your grade next year. My mom taught 2nd or 3rd grade every year.
Right.
How do I make sure he or she gets in your class? They would have you'd go and you'd sign up, and you could go in and make requests.
Right.
There would be lines of people showing up at her school in advance to request to be in her class.
Yeah.
And she was a phenomenal teacher. And yet when she would talk about why she should get paid more, it was never, look how many kids want to take my class. It was never, look at the success rate of the kids in my class. Look at the relationships I've built with my students. She still has kids that are my age.
Right.
that are still know her, that still reach out to her, that invite her to their award banquets and things like that.
Well, the point is, all those things you're talking about, real performance, that's not on the grid.
But what she'd always say, but I'm 90 degrees past my master. I'm 90 credits past my master's.
Right.
I've been doing this for X number of years,
right,
and I'm 90 credits past my master's. I'm 92 credits past my master's.
Yep.
And that was her justification. And I always just sat back looking at that saying, this sounds insane.
Yeah.
Who cares? You are a great teacher. You should be rewarded for being a great teacher.
And there are teachers out there, there are some who are not great. They're not great.
Right.
And they too, there might be some teachers who are 90 hours past their masters who are not great teachers.
Right.
And those teachers should not be rewarded the same. And we've just, put our finger on one of the serious institutional defects of the whole realm of modern education. And so when you really start to see these problems, it kind of puts a light on the fact that the solution is not necessarily commanding certain curricula or prohibiting certain curricula. I like to remind people, I'm a teacher of liberty. I love to see human beings flourish and prosper. I love to make my own choices. I want to be a self-governing human being, not a slave to someone else. So I'm in it. I'm in it for the cause of liberty. And I've spent many years teaching. I teach Karl Marx. I teach Woodrow Wilson. I teach Franklin Roosevelt, right? Because there are important lessons of liberty contained in those documents and in those texts. And at the same time, how can we preserve liberty if we don't know the enemies to liberty? I mean, we need to know what these ideas are, how they're marketed, why so many people find them attractive. I walked into an event and there were 4 gentlemen sitting towards the back, and these were big conservative philanthropists. They throw a lot of money around to a lot of organizations. And I was walking by them. They were chuckling, and one had made a crack about how Karl Marx and all of his followers were crazy.
Yeah. And
I stopped. I said, I'm just curious. Have any of you guys actually read Marx? I have. I've read virtually everything he ever published, and even a lot of his unpublished letters and things like that. Have you? And the one guy said, well, I don't need to really read it to know that it's crazy. I said, you can't know that it's crazy if you haven't actually studied it. I said, furthermore, just within very recent history, 2/3 of the inhabitable globe, Earth, was dominated by Marxist regimes.
Yeah.
There is something in that teaching that millions and millions of people have found attractive and found persuasive. And how are we going to preserve liberty if we don't understand what those ideas and what those arguments are?
Well, let's put that in very, very current event context. Russia is on the verge of invading Ukraine.
Yeah.
We keep hearing different things. By the time this gets published, there might be a full-blown war.
Right.
I can't even say it because it takes us 36 hours to actually publish these things.
Right.
And half of Ukraine right now is in favor of Russia coming in. This isn't like half the whole country is up in arms.
Right.
This is half the country is saying, no, we want Russia here. We believe in the Russian idea. Vladimir Putin is trying to put the USSR back together.
Right.
And he's starting with the Ukraine.
Right.
And there are 50% of the people there who are saying, yeah, that was a better life for us. We want that.
Mm-hmm.
This is not just some crackpot who everybody laughs off. The other thing I think that we should point to in regard to what you were saying about actually reading these things, it's a long-term process. It doesn't happen overnight. And sometimes you read something and you don't know what to do with it until several years later. But when you do get to that point several years later, it's extremely helpful. And I'll give you the perfect example. We were talking about when I did speech and debate in high school.
Mm-hmm.
I read a lot of Rousseau.
Mm-hmm.
I didn't understand the actual ties between Rousseau and progressivism at the time.
Right.
I didn't. It wasn't until you and I started having those conversations that light bulb went off.
Yep.
I knew I didn't agree with Rousseau, but I didn't know why.
Yep.
And I certainly didn't understand the connection between Rousseau and the progressive founding.
By the way, Dave, that's a great content for a seminar that we're going to add to the Academy here at the Vino Veritas Society is that connection between Rousseau and the modern American progressive movement, because it really is the intellectual foundation.
But it's so much easier for me to understand. Having read Rousseau, I was legitimately arguing and defending Rousseau in debates that I didn't truly understand the extent to which he influenced the American founding and the progressive founding. And it wasn't until years later that I actually got that next step. So you have a lot of people saying, let's keep these things away from our kids. They shouldn't read Marx. No, it was better for me. Yes. It was better for me to read that and even defend it then.
Well, and this gets to one of the great challenges of our age today. We are so polarized and increasingly divided and polarized. Many Americans today want to slap simple labels of friend and enemy. They want to know, is someone good or bad, period, right? Are they on our side or the other side?
Right.
And the world's never been that simple. I mean, one of the great examples, so many conservative, many patriotic, good Americans, they view the founding as, well, the founders were all just great. We support the founders. And that's kind of how they understand themselves, in distinction to progressives who tend to beat up and criticize the founders. But the founders themselves had all kinds of really serious, fundamental, deep divisions and disagreements. One of the more famous ones during Washington's first administration, a fascinating debate emerged between Hamilton on the one side and Jefferson and Madison on the other side. And it was a kind of cultural. They were talking about what we today would call culture. It wasn't necessarily about particular constitutional or even like policy subjects. It was, what kind of life is best for freedom in America? And Hamilton was making the argument that to be strong, to be financially independent, we need factories and industrialization, and that requires cities. You need large populations. We want banks. We want that. We want to have a big commercial urban cities. And against that, Jefferson and Madison were pushing back hard. They said that will destroy the spirit of liberty, where you get cities and banks and big businesses. You get all kinds of corruption and cronyism and terrible things. Jefferson and Madison much preferred a nation of what Jefferson once called yeoman farmers, right? But people that are connected to the ground. They're going out and digging into the soil and planting seeds that become their food, that it's a more humbling, it's a more virtuous, it's a lifestyle that cultivates or is conducive to virtue. Now, who's right in that? And the truth is, right, there were some good insights in both of those arguments, but clearly there's a deep division. You can't just say we support the founders when you have founders who are disagreeing with each other in deep ways. The best kind of education is to understand the arguments on both sides, so that that you can be, as a student of these things, you can be more thoughtful about them. It's also the case, many of these books that people either want to command or prohibit, they're not all good, they're not all bad. One of my favorite examples it's become an obscure book. It was first published in 1922 by a historian named Carl Becker. And Carl Becker was very much a progressive, that early wave of progressive academics. He was a historian. And the book is titled The Declaration of Independence, A Study in the History of Ideas. It's a beautiful book. I still, to this day, recommend it to many people. It's a great introduction to the Declaration. There's a chapter that just tells the story of how it was written, Jefferson writing the draft and Franklin and Adams making some edits and the whole process, how it actually came to be what it was. And then there's a chapter on the philosophy of the Declaration. So taking phrases like the laws of nature and kind of showing the intellectual philosophic background. There's a chapter on, he critiques the Declaration as a work of literature, of poetry, like comparing it to Shakespeare, right? Certain cadences and rhymes and things. So there's a literary take on it. All that's wonderful. It gives you this rich, broad, deep understanding of the Declaration. And at the very end, he writes, this is the second to the last page, to ask whether the ideas enshrined in the Declaration of Independence are true or false is a meaningless question. Meaningless. Right. Because he says no educated people believe in an unchanging nature. No educated person believes in the laws of nature and nature's God. They don't believe in the idea of natural rights. So we've moved on. He sees the Declaration as something that belongs in a museum. Isn't that, quaint and cute how people used to live and what they used to believe? So my point of this is there's all kinds of wonderful thinking to be mined out of that book. It's a good book to read, and there's a huge problem at the end, and even that problem presents an incredible teaching moment to be with other people, to be with students and say, is he right? Is he right that it's meaningless to ask whether these ideas are true or false? Lincoln didn't think that was meaningless. Lincoln thought that was the crux. Either all men are created equal in the sense that we all have the same equal natural rights, or not.
Right.
One or the other has to be true, right? And he wanted to know what that is. And so, when people start gearing up to prohibit literature and command curricula, I look at something like Carl Becker's book. And I say, wait, what would you do with that? Would you put it on the burning stack? Books to be burned. I mean, there's a lot of useful information in there.
Well, and this goes back to, it's so hard because you have so many people who say, look at all these horrid past regimes, not even just in America, but throughout history, that have burned books, that have banned segments of society from reading books or reading anything or certain things. And then you turn around and say, well, okay, all that was bad. You shouldn't have done all of that. But now I want to control what you read.
Right.
So now I'm going to tell you to get rid of Marx and get rid of all of these things. And at some point, we do have to decide, what are we in favor of? And I think that comes back to these 12 states that have bills now being proposed to control education. And these bills are being written, in a sense, out of fear. They are correct to be afraid. I don't want to diminish the fear that people have. The ideas of teaching critical race theory that are happening in schools, the things like the congresswoman in Appleton, Wisconsin, is that where she was? Oh, Appleton, Illinois.
This is like a character out of.
Yeah, I didn't try to remember her name.
I think it's Snodgrass.
Yes,
I believe
it sounded like Dr. Seuss.
Yeah.
She's sitting there saying parents have no right to know what their kids are learning and all that. You have every right to be angry and afraid and stand up and say that is wrong. I want to say, and I want to know what my kids are being taught. I want to know how my kids are being taught. My warning to everybody and everybody listening to this podcast, and we do have a lot of members who are either running for office or helping people run for office.
Right.
The fight cannot be about, you don't read that, you read what I say instead. Because it goes back to your example of the teacher in California saying, okay, we have to study the Declaration of Independence. So we're going to study why it's written by homophobic,
racist, sexist,
whatever. And they did all of that in California with you involved, right? At the Claremont Institute, you got involved and you said, here are all the things that people should know. And look where California is today.
Great point.
We're 2 decades later, and California is a complete and total mess. So it didn't do anything to say, go make sure we read all these things, because if they're not taught well, it doesn't matter. The goal should be, I want my kids learning how to think. And I want teachers to be expected to teach my kids how to think and who have an orthodoxy to the right mindset, the right way of thinking. And I want the choice to be able to take my kid away from a teacher who is trying to force bad orthodoxy on my kids.
That word choice is, I mean, it really is central in this whole question. I mean, the truth is, and I'm gonna call out the 800-pound elephant in the room here that very few people are willing to say. I mean, the real problem ultimately is the very concept of public education. That is ultimately the real. This idea that we're going to make some people subsidize the education of other people's children. And we're going to do it via government threats of force. Government's going to come and take your money and then use that to run schools the way government bureaucrats want to run. That's the real problem. Now, the fact is we have it. It's gigantic, right? That public educational leviathan is huge. It's not like we're going to get rid of it next week or next month. So short of getting rid of it, short of saying to Americans, I mean, the real answer is to say to Americans, you be responsible for your own child's education. Everyone be responsible for your own children's education. There's the solution. Short of that, what can we do with this gigantic public education leviathan? We can create as many opportunities for choice as possible.
Right.
So, states that have charter school laws that make it relatively easy to start charter schools, that's great. States that don't should do it. That there's something to work on. If you're in a state that does not have charter school friendly laws, get them. Get those laws. Get your state legislature to adopt those kinds of laws, because it's choice. Is when schools are doing bad things, when schools are banning some books, the solution is not to go and say, no, we want to ban other books.
Yeah.
I mean, that's your point you just made.
Yeah.
That should not be the debate should not be which books are going to be banned. The debate should be, you're banning books over there, then we're going to go to a different school.
Yep.
Where either they read better books or they have better teachers, or, the students are encouraged to think freely. It also goes to a point, Jefferson made this, he made an assertion. It's at the very end of his Virginia Statute for Religious Liberty. And those who have not read it, I strongly encourage you to go read it. It's short. It can be printed on a page and a half. This is a law. Hard to believe, right? In a day where modern laws are 2,000 or 3,000 pages long, right? This is about 700 words.
You didn't have to pass it to know what was in it.
That's right. You could actually read it before it's being passed, and it's beautiful. It is beautifully written, and he asserts at the end that truth is great, truth is powerful, and truth has nothing to fear from error of opinion. Right? Erroneous opinions. It has nothing to fear as long as truth has its natural weapons. And its natural weapons are free debate, free speech.
Right.
As long as people can speak freely and analyze opinions and arguments and ideas, truth will emerge sooner or later. The problem is when truth is when those natural weapons of truth are taken away. And there is no free speech, and there is no open debate and open analysis and open discussion of ideas, then truth is doomed to darkness. Truth has a really tough time, right, when speech is controlled. Well, the question for us today, is Jefferson right? Was Jefferson right about that? That truth is great and truth can take care of itself as long as people are able to speak freely and openly? Or do we need to have something like a ministry of truth that says, here's the official truth, and we are going to prohibit, any expression that contradicts what the ministry of truth says is the truth?
Tom, I think 1984 is a banned book. You're right. I mean, the reality is we have to have this open discussion, and open discussion requires understanding of both sides of an argument. You are never going to be successful in having an open pursuit of truth if you say we're only going to study one thing, and it goes for both sides of the argument. If one side says we're going to make sure everyone only knows this side, they don't know why this other side is bad.
Yep.
And what ends up happening, and what I believe has ended up happening over the last handful of years, and actually really throughout American history in one way or another, is you have one side saying this is the way, this is what we all have to learn, and everybody learns this. And then we had banned, because of World War II and because of I guess even earlier, going back to World War I, we had really banned a lot of the Marxist texts in this country, right? You couldn't have communism. Communism, I mean, believe me, I'm the first one to say communism is an awful, awful, awful thing.
Right.
But we were so afraid of it that we started banning all reading of Marx and anything that was related to the Communist Manifesto.
Remember, the United States House of Representatives established a special committee on the House Un-Americans Activities Committee, right? Where they're subpoenaing people from Hollywood and higher education, anyone suspected of communist activities.
Right. So when you don't explore it, when you don't read it, when nobody knows what it is, a generation later or 2 generations later, kids start to see this.
Yeah.
I've never seen this before. This must be new.
It's a great
This
point.
is exciting. This is different.
Yeah.
I don't like the way my life is right now. And here's the thing. Nobody's ever really happy with the way their life is, right? They always think about, you talk about human nature never changing.
What's the old cliche? The grass is always greener on the other side of the fence, right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
And you talk about human nature never changing. There's one thing true about human nature. We always look at what we don't have before we look at the things that we do.
Yep.
And if you're looking at it in those terms, life was great under Trump. I mean, in a lot of ways, life was great. We had low gas prices. We had low inflation. We had low unemployment. We had a lot of those key indicators. Things were really good. Mm-hmm. But Orange Man bad. And these new communist ideas that were new to some people, right? They don't realize, or progressivism. You have these people thinking, well, progressivism was something created by Obama. Or AOC. If you're young enough, that's what you think.
Right.
You don't know because you haven't been taught that this was actually taught by John Dewey and Woodrow Wilson and FDR. And this is 150 years old. Oh, there's this brand new, nice, shiny thing over here called progressivism. I want to go in that direction. Called communism. Communism isn't bad. Communism has only helped people throughout the history of the world. Never mind the 100 million people it's killed in the last century. Yeah. The benefit of teaching both sides and getting good teachers and training good teachers. And if you want to change the trajectory of education, change the teachers, change the expectations on teachers to get jobs, change what it takes to be hired and how you get paid and what the value is of teaching in terms of how you value teachers and how they get compensated. And when you do that, and they teach both sides, and we consistently look at, here's both sides of the story. Right. You never get that opportunity of somebody saying, communism's this new shiny thing over here. I've never heard of that before. Why would you think communism's bad? It sounds so good. We're going to all help each other.
Because they'll know it's not new.
Right.
And it's certainly not shiny.
And it never helped anybody.
Well, it did help it did always help a few crony, comrade leaders, the chiefs of the Communist Party. They tend to live nice, at least for a while, until they were,
And the sons of heads of state who they wanted help from. Yeah. Like Hunter Biden. Yeah. Yeah. And I did say it, and I will stand by that. So I think that's the point here. And I hope our members will take that message. Mm-hmm. If we're going to defend the American idea, that does not mean ignoring the progressive idea. That does not mean ignoring everything we don't agree with. It doesn't mean banning everything we don't agree with. I would say know your enemy better than you know yourself. And you've used the analogy about a football team very often. We just had the Super Bowl, and I guarantee Sean McVay, who was the coach of the Rams, spent more time studying the Cincinnati Bengals than his own team.
Right. Got to know the other team. I think this is a safe way to summarize this discussion. When it comes to this important topic of education and all the current controversies bubbling around, don't reach for control. Don't reach for more banning and prohibiting. Rather, reach for choice. Yep. And reach for, if you really want to shake up the world of education, restructure your schools. Restructure how people are hired, why they're hired, and how they get rewarded, rather than the traditional system we've had for so long.
That's one more step we need in order to protect the American idea, to guard the American idea.
Which is what we're all about here at the Vino Veritas Society.
Nos somos custodes.